How do the principles of feminism intersect with the concept of patriarchy? And is patriarchy synonymous with gender inequality or merely its outcome?
Passionate, under the guise of being well intentioned, under the guise of being protective, you're actually holding back women and you're holding back their growth.
So I don't think it's about let's take a machete and hack all of it down, because it's everywhere. It's in our thinking, it's in our structuring, it's in our scriptures, it's in our inventions, it's everywhere. So, what I think is the way to really go about it is to start creating points of access. So, to me, for example, the Me Too movement was a point of access.
Tactic that I followed, which Megha and I also discussed, was the idea of just surrendering at that point, of saying that let me appear to surrender for now, let me agree with what they're saying, just, not argue with them, but go back, regroup, and most importantly, find the allies that I needed to make myself stronger.
And it's done it at a platform where people can engage. And
Very.
it's interesting, right, to use Barbie, which is the perpetuator of those gendered stereotypes and has gotten so much flack for so many years for promoting this idea of stereotypical beauty and women's purpose, to use that to sort of have this conversation about patriarchy. So, in that sense, I think it was a great, clever ploy for them
Aparna.
to use.
Hi, welcome to the Mohua Show. My name is Mohua Chinappa and I am an author, entrepreneur, and ex housewife. This podcast is about everything from business to technology to arts to lifestyle, but done and spoken ईमानदारी से.
Hi, in today's episode, we have with us Aparna Piramal Raje, an author, columnist, and a public speaker, along with Megha Mawandia, who's a Mumbai based family therapist. So, we're extremely excited about this podcast because we are going to break down some aspects of patriarchy that I have not done in the earlier podcasts. And the word that Aparna sent me an article that said that for Women's Day, we need to call it Anti-Patriarchy Day. So let's just begin with a question, Aparna, to you that how do the principles of feminism intersect with the concept of patriarchy, and is patriarchy synonymous with gender inequality or merely its outcome?
Thanks, Mawa. Thanks for having us on the show and digging deep into patriarchy. So, we think, both Megha and I feel that feminism is really an outcome of patriarchy. And I think it's very simple for most people to reduce them to men versus women. So, to think of patriarchy as being a system that is perpetuated by men, and to think of feminism as a system that is perpetuated by women. But actually, there's a very important distinction between them, which is really patriarchy is a system where where women are unfairly excluded from power or gain, and it's a system in which both men and women are complicit in. So, and it's also a system that can hurt men and women, as we can go on to explain. But it's not really a system of men and by men and for men against only women, right? Um, and similarly, feminism is a response to this inequality. It's just response to the fact that women are being excluded, and other segments of society also. So it is a response by that, but it is also not to say feminism is not a movement to say women are better than men. And I think that there is a feeling now that feminism is all about anti-men. Feminism is not about being anti-men. Feminism is about men and women in favor of equality and fairness and equity and justice. So it's a system that's what we both of us very strongly believe.
I completely agree with you because since the time I began writing, and my writing is, pro women because of the inequalities, and so I often get this from a lot of my readers, and even in the social circle that men are not too bad, and men, it's not about male bashing, and I'm not bashing. I'm just talking about equality. Places where I feel that I'm not seen, not heard, and not allowed to express. So now I need to ask Megha a question. Okay, considering worldwide problems like gender-based violence, unequal representation in leadership positions, which we know that it's really stark, it's staring at our face. How can anti-patriarchy day serve as a catalyst for addressing this systemic issues on a global scale? And do you think that patriarchy represents the biggest systemic challenge?
So I'm going to answer that in two parts because I think you've asked me two pretty big questions. One is why have an anti-patriarchy day at all, right? And what does it represent? And the reality is a celebration of a day like that is an invitation to a conversation. And the more conversations we have, the more we're able to break down social structures, whether it's top down or down up. So when you're talking about breaking down political systems or having representation of women in positions of power, that requires some pretty strong conversations, because it's not only about preparing women to take on that power, it's also about preparing men to let go of power. And the reality is none of us want to let go of a power, not because we don't want to per se let go of it. We don't know what it means to let go of it. We don't know how to operate when it's not there in our hands. We're used to it. It's been handed out like a baton from generation to generation. So I feel the presence of a day like that becomes a presence of a conversation, which is something we've experienced through this one piece. Look at the number of conversations we're having, whether it's coming up on this podcast, whether it's the writers writing into us. It's come into my therapy session ever since the article came out. Like every session, this conversation is being spoken about by men and by women. So that's one part of it. And the second part, sorry, could you repeat that to me? The second part that you asked me, the end of your
So I
question.
wanted to know this. Do you feel that patriarchy represents the biggest systemic challenge?
Yeah. I would say it represents the most omnipresent challenge for sure, because it is systemic and it is omnipresent and it bypasses pretty much every other system we have, because all systems have been designed by men. You tell me which is a system which has been designed by women, and you will have an answer to that. Because, and it's not because we want to define men and women are separate, or they're not equals, or they're equals, or they're biologically different, or they're not. The reality is all of that is true. There are differences. There are differences in how we think. And I'm not getting into a binary discussion here at all. Maybe the differences are perpetuated because of the system of strength and power versus weakness and protection. But there is a different energy that comes into any decision making when women are also involved. So I do feel that patriarchy is a massive systemic challenge that we're dealing with,
Yeah,
omnipresent.
and it seems like a very huge mountain to climb. And I think I'm so proud that social media has become a huge tool for many women to express themselves. And women are getting together. Like if you look at the hashtag Me Too campaign that started, I think for the first time, women were actually being unabashed, in talking about the kind of assault that they've had at their place of work, which I think in the past would have been totally an unimaginable conversation to ever have. So I need to ask you, Aparna, what is the concept of benign patriarchy? Of course, this is a word that I need you to break it down for us. And what impact does it have on the portrayal and treatment of women? And do you think benign patriarchy is only for women?
Okay, let's take those questions one by one. So, first of all, Mahua, you talked about Me Too. And I think that when we think of patriarchy, we think of outright patriarchy and benign patriarchy. So, an incident like a Me Too or sexual harassment is something which is very visible, which is a outright patriarchy. There's no question marks about it. There's no dispute about it. I think all of us understand that intuitively. Benign patriarchy for us is different, and when we say benign, we put benign almost in quotation marks because it's not really benign, but it looks benign. So under the guise of compassion, women's hopes, dreams, ambitions are limited. So for example, you could have a situation which happened to me where I was talking to one of my mental health professionals, and they were quietly discouraging me from writing. And they were saying things like, oh, your husband is so busy, why don't you support them? Their career is so important. Look after the children. You plan the summer holidays so well. So they are trying to be well intentioned. Okay, maybe it is said in a way that is well intentioned or compassionate, but actually they're really limiting. And I think that it comes under that realm of wanting to protect someone. and say that under the guise of being compassionate, under the guise of being well intentioned, under the guise of being protective, you're actually holding back women and you're holding back their growth. So this is what benign patriarchy is, according to us. And we see a lot of examples. Megha can share some from her practice too. And then, in terms of asking about does it happen only to women, I think that, I had a very long email from one man who said that, listen, this happens to men too, but we don't call it patriarchy. We just move on with it. So I think that that is, possibly women are not the only people being affected, but we see this happening a lot because women are expected to take on this role that is very nurturing and be homely in many cases and not be ambitious. And those are the stereotypes that are being perpetuated by women that benign patriarchy endorses. And the other aspect is just important to keep in mind that women are also complicit in this, that it's not just that it's only about, again, what we're saying, that there's a man trying to subvert a woman's ambitions. I've also had women trying to tell me that you need to kind of slow down, or you need to not be so ambitious. So I think it's both. That's what we're trying to say, that patriarchy is really about a system which is holding women back, and it's about men and women being part of that system. And certainly, of course, there are plenty of examples of men who also want to subvert that system and who want to see women grow. So we've had those examples too. So, yeah.
So, Aparna, talking about this entire thing where you're saying that women are, they are very much a part and parcel of this sort of a patriarchal system that has been continuing for so long. So, do you think the struggle against this whole flawed, culture which transcends, of course, geographical boundaries? I mean, especially with the kind of conversations that I've had with so many people across the world, it's unbelievable the kind of patriarchy, and blatant and benign both exist and they coexist together. So there's racial division, there's religious affiliations, political ideologies, and workplace dynamics. So how do you think that one can kind of bring in all these aspects together? Because each of these things need to come to a point where we start addressing this very term that you said, benign patriarchy.
Well, I think just be aware of what's happening, and be able to call it out, right? So I think, first of all, to words like labels like benign patriarchy or benevolent sexism, as some people call it, it just allows people to recognize what's going on. And I think just being able to resonate, because I think we don't have the vocabulary. Going back to Megha's point about having the conversation, why it's important for us to do this is just to have the vocabulary to recognize what's going on, and then to call it out, and really to be able to find a voice. I think that is the biggest struggle that all of us might have had as women, of just finding that unique voice and speaking up, right? And saying that this just doesn't work for me, right? This is something else that I need to be kind of expressing myself, finding an identity for myself beyond what people are trying to impose on me. So, but I think it cuts across. It cuts across regions. It cuts across class. It cuts across everywhere.
Yes, it does. So, Megha, you know what? I think, the question that comes to my head is this: how did this entire entrenched presence, of male dominance, throughout history, we know that, that has contributed to this very unnoticed prevalence of benign patriarchy, in quotes, as you use the word, contrasting with the Greeks' discourse in political systems, male supremacy was considered a very natural thing. And it's self-perpetuating, because as men predominantly authored the laws, poetry, religious texts, and we know that, I mean, many of us don't even have the courage to question so many things that have been passed on to us as stories, the Cinderella complex, and it's always a man who will come in and save you. There's philosophy, there's history, there's medical writing, scientific work. All of this is to the advantage of men. How does one challenge this entire thing? Because it seems like a huge mountain of years and years and centuries of concepts that have been passed on to us, and exactly how Aparna said, that we are probably not even aware how we accept all of this and continue to have this dialogue without any change in it. So let's just hear a little bit from you.
I think what you're posing is a very interesting question, because what you're asking for, what do we do about this, right? And how do we go from here? What is our call to action, really? And the first thing I want to say is it's not about challenging it, because you cannot take a system that's as omnipresent as this is and topple it down without having something in place to start building up around it, because it's a structure that our entire society as we know it and across through the globe is built upon. So I don't think it's about let's take a machete and hack all of it down, because it's everywhere. It's in our thinking, it's in our structuring, it's in our scriptures, it's in our inventions, it's everywhere. So, what I think is the way to really go about it is to start creating points of access. So, to me, for example, the Me Too movement was a point of access. It was through this access people got a vehicle to start talking about things that they'd realized or didn't realize, but were able to now encapsulate and make visible. Feminism is another access to this benignness, because through it people are able to realize, okay, I have a voice, I have a power, I have a right. If we're going to look at the genesis of humanity, I mean, we've gone from being hunter gatherers to being people who fight wars over the internet, right? So we've gone through our own systems of evolution. How does this next wave of evolution take women more into the center? How does it actually work on removing gender bias and creating a society which invites rather than excludes? So that's the kind of conversation we want to have. And the how do we do it is by inviting these conversations and having various stakeholders involved in spaces where power is debated, and where rules are made, where systems are managed. And instead of asking someone to give away a spot, to just ask people to make a little more room on the bench, I think that's a better way for us to start getting that invitation. Because honestly, you have 50% of the world's population which isn't getting enough recognition, which isn't working hard enough. Productivity wise, we're just going to go do better. This isn't about taking it away from the men, it's about providing space to the women also.
Completely agree with you on this. So, Megha, you know what? How can the film industry and the political spheres, implement strategies to amplify the voices of the marginalized, and also dismantle patriarchal structures? Because that's, films play such a huge role. And I don't want to, take names of films, but of course, there was Animal that kind of really was shocking. And so many people were very, very comfortable about this sort of in your face. I'd seen Kabir Singh and I came back horrified. Where they completely normalized the man slapping his girlfriend and, being this absolute cuckoo of a hero. And so, how do we kind of, have these sort of conversations where so many people are completely wearing, dark glasses to this absolutely flawed narrative of gender equality?
Yeah. So first of all, as a therapist, I get to be at this vantage point where I get to see without bias and judgment, what do these voices represent, right? I, just as you, find toxic masculinity very problematic, and am up in arms and upset about the portrayal of all this kind of stuff in the media. But I'm also someone who wants to study, why does this become so popular? Who is this speaking to? And why are they finding the need of this to feel resonating? And what can we do to bring them onto our side of the table, right? Where we want to gently but solidly break down these ideas and talk about what it's excluding. And what it's really talking about is something Aparna and I talk about a lot, which is we're not giving men a blueprint on how to respond to benign patriarchy, because it's seeming like we're coming with it, it's seeming like we're at war and there are two sides, and that's why then this becomes a solution, the toxicity and the violence and the old way, because that was a safe way. But if we start creating safe conversations of what could be a new way where both of us can coexist, I think we might have lesser need for these sort of problematic discourses. That is not to say that there is not a very, very important responsibility, which I don't think people in positions of power take seriously enough. So, whether it's the politicians, whether it's movie stars, celebrities, pop stars, whatever you want to call it, they also need to recognize the power that they wield over their followers, right? So one little flick of a finger has a response, which means you need to be really mindful and careful of what you're flicking, where you're flicking, and what are you representing and who are you not representing when you're doing that flicking. So I do think there needs to be a lot of education and conversation amongst those systems of power to actually take ownership of how much their impact matters, right? So yeah, that's what I feel.
So, Megha, I'm sure, I mean, you've had many, many, people with whom you are working on a regular basis. So, do you think this entire change in this, concept of patriarchy will also benefit the men? And if it will benefit the men, I would want our listeners to hear from you. How would you address it for them? Because we have listeners from all age groups, and I'd really like to, request you to say some of these words out loud. Because we're talking about equality also when it comes to sharing of roles at home. It is automatically the woman who is in charge of all the family duties. There are many homes even today that girls have gone through a breakup in their marriage, and then they turn around. The word that they use is this: that I found shelter in my parents' home, and those doors remain closed for majority of women, so that they're very frightened to get out of a toxic marriage, a toxic relationship. Would you please share some maybe examples from your the cases that you've handled, people that you've spoken to, and also your thoughts on it?
Absolutely. So, obviously, because of privacy concerns, I cannot give you very exact quotations or exact examples of people, but I can definitely encapsulate the kind of work that I do see in my room, where I do have a lot of men ranging from the age of 25 going up to like 65 years of age. And repeatedly the kind of and it's always a question I ask them, that I put in my bio that I'm a feminist, so what makes you come to me? And they say, we want a safe space to actually understand what you're talking about. Because you see, at each generation, my thinking is built on the context of the society around me. So if I'm 65 today, my thinking has been shaped when I was 15, 20, etc. years old. Now the world has changed, but the pockets where I'm interacting, that hasn't changed. I'm still talking to other 65-year-old men. And when I go and talk to the 65-year-old women, they're just so angry. They're not necessarily using language which feels like a welcome invitation to talk about things. So the first thing they've really talked about is, can you please have conversations with us in a language or in a way that we can understand? So I think it's important for us to have literature out there, examples out there, which isn't accusatory, which doesn't shut doors, but acts like an invitation and gently uh, has a conversation. This is not to say that it's the women's job to do this. I'm not saying that at all. This is just to say that this is what the men are asking for. Now, how we want to engage with it is a different conversation around that. The second thing they talk about a lot is, you know, we know through our systems of alcohol abuse, substance abuse, etc., and the prevalence of it amongst young men, it's essentially the pressure of providing. And economic structures be as they are, the man feels an inordinate amount of that pressure, and as power systems work, uses that pressure to subjugate the women around them. So if we're able to create, I mean, why can't women earn better? Why can't we have better access to childcare, healthcare, and ability for women to also play the role of providing support in a more equal fashion? And it's not because women aren't working hard, it's because doors shut on women with a lot more ferociousness than they shut on men. Doors open for men at the touch of a finger, while women have to jump through a lot of hoops. So, systematically, we need to support that sharing of that load. Another thing that men really talk about is not having enough spaces to have emotional conversations. They say, I don't know who. I've had men sitting in my room saying, I can't talk to my wife, I can't talk to my mother, I can't talk to my children, I can't talk to. You're literally the only person in this whole world who I can actually bring these feelings to, because everywhere else it becomes something else. See, women, they gather and they have conversations which feel safe because that has been their way of coping with what they have dealt with. Men don't have those spaces. So I feel like these are largely the things that get spoken about a lot and needs a lot more addressing.
I'm sure we're going to reach there, and I hope to God we do, because any human being who's not allowed to express is definitely going to have very, very stunted emotions, and irrespective of gender. So, Aparna, what strategies do you think should be implemented, to address or tackle benign patriarchy? I think one is this, that for our listeners, we've understood a little bit about benign patriarchy, but it would be wonderful to hear from you what would be these underlying structures, attitudes that perpetuate gender inequality, that are very, very harmful in so many ways. When we're not comparing this to extreme forms of patriarchy, but this just benign patriarchy, like you mentioned, that people discouraged you from writing. Exactly, for me, everyone discouraged me from rebooting when I rebooted in my late 40s, and everyone just said that I mean, why are you even doing this, and why can't you just chill now in life? But I wanted to express, I needed to get a voice out. And so I need to hear from you, especially for so many of my young listeners, what would you talk about benign patriarchy that goes beyond giving us the autonomy to have choices of our own and agency over ourselves?
Yeah, so my incidents of benign patriarchy really happened at a time when I actually was vulnerable, and I wasn't really in a position to fight back immediately. So I think, as you said, with blatant patriarchy or outright patriarchy, you want to just fight, right? You're angry, you're frustrated. But with benign patriarchy, somebody is actually trying to be nice to you. Like, they think they're being nice to you, they think they're doing it. They think that, by imposing that patriarchy on you, they are making you feel better. So in my case, actually, the tactic that I followed, which Megha and I also discussed, was the idea of just surrendering at that point, of saying that, let me appear to surrender for now, let me agree with what they're saying, just, not argue with them, but go back, regroup, and most importantly, find the allies that I needed to make myself stronger. So when I was told not to write, I immediately formed a group on WhatsApp saying, I think I called it Bipolar Girl Support Group or something like that. And I immediately called in 5 friends and I said, listen, this is what's going on. What should I do? And they made a joke about it. They said, this is a funny thing that you could actually tell them. But they all said, you must write, and I found the allies that I needed. I found the strength. And when I was more healed and recovered, I got back into the writing. So I think at times you have to recognize that we don't all fight the every battle in the same way. And this was actually that worked for me, is that to find a time when I could actually become stronger, even though it looked like I might appear to surrender at some point, but then come back and fight even stronger. So, but it's
So, Aparna, you know what? I think it'll really help many of our listeners, because it takes tremendous courage to even accept it. That you've had a stint where you have been dealing with mental illness, right? And when the first time you decided to come out and speak about it, what were those feelings, and how did you overcome that? I mean, this is especially for so many women who probably are very frightened to say this, especially because if their relationships are falling apart, they're not being able to manage their jobs, they just start, turning the lens towards themselves. I still remember that, when if I was harassed by a boy, I grew up in Delhi, and when you go into college and you've been teased, or there's been somebody who's been following you, the first thing that people around you will ask you, tumne kuch kiya kya? So always women are very frightened. So just if you could just tell our listeners what it took for you to break out of this entire taboo.
Yeah, I think I always say that courage is a marathon. I think for me, courage is not an overnight sprint. I don't think you become brave overnight. I think courage is a marathon. I think it takes time. I think the first time after I got my diagnosis and I had to go to the dentist, and the dentist asked me, "Are you taking any medication?" And I had to say that I'm taking some medication for bipolar. I was very hesitant. Should I even write that I'm taking this medication for being bipolar? And look at me now, and that was just 10 years ago, and now in 10 years I've written a book and I've done 100 talks about it, right? So there's been that transition, but that courage is a marathon for me, which starts with trust and ends with normalization. You have to find people that you can trust and talk about it. For me, that was really important. That's what I've done in my entire journey. I've always spoken to people who I trusted. I've shared my vulnerability with them. I've asked them for help. I've sought their advice. I've listened to what they had to say. And that is the trust that helps you go past that finishing line. Until then, it becomes so normal in your head. Whatever you're dealing with, whatever that vulnerability that you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with anxiety or depression or anything else in your mind, then you can kind of normalize and say, I can just work through this. Like for me, my mental health condition and my illnesses, I don't even think of it as an illness, I call it a condition. It's just something I live with. It's no different from saying I have a thyroid issue or might be having diabetes or something like that. There's no difference in my mind. It's been completely normalized. But that courage to do that courage was because it was a marathon journey, and that marathon journey really
So I
starts
have a
with
question
trust.
for both of you right now. How do you think the Barbie movie explains the psychology of patriarchy? It's been one of my most fun films to watch. I, of course, went with my son. I yanked him, and we had a good laugh when we watched the film together. The biggest takeaway I think that remains is the fact that the world cannot be a place really ruled only by men, as in the case of the real world, and or a place that's only ruled by women. In the case of Barbie Land, right? She did step out and. She did realize that it was very, very difficult outside. So, what was your takeaway from that film?
All right, I have two teenage daughters, so I definitely have a lot to speak about this. I think that movie very cleverly brought about showed us how easy it is for a man to take over what seems like a woman's world. I think the story of Ken in that movie is significant because she goes away for 3 days and boom, it's Ken's world. And that's really the gatekeeping women end up doing a lot in the small spaces they inhabit. And that's where a lot of the aggression comes from because even though they've created this little world, it's still being controlled by it has other interests at play. There isn't enough freedom in there for them to go about and do it the way they want. They have to follow those defined stereotypes to stay within it. So I think it was a movie that really brought home some of these truths. It did it in a fairly clever manner. And it's done it at a platform where people can engage. And
Very.
it's interesting, right, to use Barbie, which is the perpetuator of those gendered stereotypes and has gotten so much flack for so many years for promoting this idea of stereotypical beauty and women's purpose, to use that to sort of have this conversation about patriarchy. So, in that sense, I think it was a great, clever ploy for them
Aparna.
to use. Made up for some of Barbie's terrible image.
Yeah, I mean, I have teenage boys, and there was just no way that I could get them to watch it, unlike yours, Mahua. So, I think I would agree with Megha that it was a great film. There was a time, I think there was a monologue at one point which I was ready. I think I did applaud. Probably I was the only one in the cinema who actually applauded at it. But I think yes, to use this character of Barbie to talk about the whole idea of patriarchy and feminism in different ways, in a creative way, and to get people to engage with it at such a level just shows the potential of what is possible, right? That I think that all we all need to really use our imaginations to think of a future that is different, because as you said, it's neither a male world or a female world. We're all going to be existing together. So I think it's what I'm probably most interested is part two, right? Like, what does Barbie do when she realizes that she wants to live in the real world and she wants to kind of reinvent some of those rules. I would really look forward to
I would
that
look
film.
forward to also Barbie, getting being menopausal, to Barbie getting hot. to Barbie going through the entire rigmarole that women go through, and we're so ashamed to talk about it. I think we've not even begun the conversation about our own health, which is the most natural thing, but we are so scared to talk about it, because there's such a fear that's attached with being infertile after many years and not being able to conceive, because that's where we see our own value also. So, the last question that is for both of you, so we can ask Megha, can you just provide examples from India and worldwide, where you have observed the practical existence of benign patriarchy? And the same question also for you, Aparna, because it'll really help, I think, people who are really, listening to us right now. What would be those practical examples for them to be able to recognize benign patriarchy? So, Megha, you could go first.
Yeah. So I feel the practical examples to recognize is to actually check in with your body when you're inhabiting a space or you're making a decision or you're being told you're in charge, but your body isn't feeling light and free and able to make those decisions. There is definitely a presence of benign patriarchy there because you're in the driver's seat, but somebody else is calling the shots. And it becomes important for us to be able to recognize who is calling the shots. Is it in my interest? Whose interest is it? Who does it serve? And what do I want to do about this system? So the first tip I have is check in with the body. Second is what Aparna already talked about, to have spaces around you where you can feel be heard, you can have conversations, you can discuss, because till somebody doesn't call a color red, you don't know how to identify red. And the more conversations we have, the more, I can't tell you how many times clients come into the session and say, am I the only one feeling this? And then when I show them 5 examples or a book which is written about exactly what they're feeling, they feel so validated because they say, for so many years, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the problem. I thought I didn't have the language to be able to talk about it. So we can only break that by talking to people who are in those positions, who are willing to have these conversations with us. So these are the two large ones that I can share as tips.
Yeah, I think, Mohua, again, just going back to what we said earlier, just when you feel that you're being held back by sometimes the people you trust the most. I think sometimes you have to look around the people you trust the most, your homes, your schools, your workplaces, your family members. These are sometimes, they have your interest at heart, but they might be holding you back. So, an example would be, let's say, somebody who's really qualified, who's educated, who's studied well, but they want to work, but they're told no, they can only work in the family business. They don't, you can't work outside in somebody else's company. So that's another example of that. Or Megha from her own practice has said that there have been mothers who come in and tell their daughters that, oh, you need to be thin if you're going to be popular, and so I need to put you on a diet and get you to meet a nutritionist, when actually there's, the child is not obese by any means. Or people who, mothers who drag their daughters to the dermatologist saying, can you become fairer? We're all looking at these from the male gaze. It's all from the male point of view, that you are ultimately looking at your marriage prospects and things like that. So these are things done by people who ostensibly care for you, but you have to really ask, is, are they making you feel good about yourself? Is this what you celebrate about yourself? Is this what is important to you? And I think that it's important to just take that step back and look around it, and then see ways that you can actually manage it and
Thank
deal
you
with it.
so much for being on today's podcast. And this was it's so heartfelt. It's a subject that's very close to my heart, Aparna and Megha. And thank you so much for taking all the time for being on today's show. Thank you.
To you, our dearest listeners, you can find us on your favorite streaming services: Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and of course on all other major streaming services. With loads of love, we are The Mohua Show, where we talk imandari se.